Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another ad hoc video. So today we're going to be talking about something really cool. We're going to be looking at sonography or using ultrasound technology to view hair structures or hair follicle structures in the skin. Now, this paper that we're looking at is titled, quote, Sonography in Pathologies of the Scalp and Hair, unquote, by X Worman et al., and it was published in August 2011 in the British Institute of Radiology. So, let's get started. So, I'm not going to read all of this study. I'm just going to point out some cool things where they were using, over here, they said, quote, to improve the medical approach to diseases of the scalp, we evaluated color Doppler ultrasound, a technique already applied to the study of localized lesions of the skin, unquote. So, with them using colored ultrasound technology, they were able to view areas of blood flow, such as over here. You could see where blood was moving. If you're not looking at the screen, please look at the screen. But I think it's really cool because they can kind of tell where there's areas of inflammation, right? If we go to this particular section over here, where they're able to see areas that have increased inflammation and decreased inflammation, and also increased blood flow and decreased blood flow, right? So that can kind of tell us some things. If an area is, rife with a lot of, let's say, blood, right, or a lot of excess fluid, it could kind of suggest that, okay, maybe there's some sort of inflammatory thing that's going on. But I want to go further back up into the study. So, first and foremost, the ultrasound technology at specific frequencies, it's able to kind of show the, I guess, hair follicle structures and topology of the skin or the dermal structure. If you look at the screen right now, if you're looking at the white arrows in the study, you can see that these sort of lines, right, these sort of black voids are actually hair follicles, right? So we have one over here, another one over here. I would argue that this is a follicle right over here too. Another one over here, another one over here, and maybe one over here. These are sort of follicles, right? And another cool thing about using ultrasound technology or sonography is that you can tell which hair follicles are in anagen or telogen, right? Because telogen hairs are much more close to or at least telogen hair follicles are much more closer up in terms of the strata of the skin, and catagen or anagen hair follicles are deeper within the skin, as it's showing over here, right? It shows at a deeper layer. An anagen hair follicle has its dermal papilla or its root deeper within the hair follicle or the skin structure, the skin layer structure. So that's actually a very unique way of kind of seeing if someone's responding to treatment, right? So we have this thing where people, and especially in clinical trials, they do biopsies, right? And they do biopsies because they want to see the anagen to telogen ratio. Now, a biopsy isn't easily repeatable, such that you can't just get biopsies whenever you want to know your anagen to telogen ratio, whenever you want to know how many hair follicles are actively growing and how many are actively, or I guess you can say how many are dormant. And the reason for this is because, well, every time you do a scalp biopsy, that area that is excised, what results is that you get a scar in that area, just a small scar, but those follicles are permanently lost, right? However, if we had a much less invasive, barely invasive sort of viewing of the scalp structures, of the hair follicle structures, that is, using sonography could be a really good solution. And actually, it could tell somebody if they're about to have a major shed, right? If you're able to use sonography and you can tell that in a given area, let's say 40% of the hair follicles are in the catagen phase, well, that's going to forecast that this person is going to have in the future a shedding episode, right? If you notice that there are more telogen and catagen hairs, that means that, okay, your patient or your client, whatever, they will be experiencing a shed of some kind. And maybe you can forecast this when people are using treatment, right? So if somebody starts using dutasteride and we're able to see that the scalp DHT has substantially lowered, and we can do that by analyzing the sebum from the scalp, right? To kind of predict in a less invasive way than a biopsy, we can assess the sebum to see, okay, we've noticed a decrease in scalp DHT, but at the same time, right, we can also use sonography to kind of see the transition of the anagen cycle into, other sort of phases. And if we're able to notice that, okay, X amount of hairs are entering to catagen after, let's say 2 weeks, they're in early catagen, or they're a lot of the hairs are moving into a telogen phase, then we can say that, okay, we can probably predict this person is going to shed, and given the excess amount of telogen hair follicles, we can possibly predict how long it'll take for this person to recover from that shed or to go back into a growth cycle, right? A period of anagen. So this is a very, very interesting sort of concept that I'm, sort of exploring here. So I can imagine future, treatments or future technologies where you look at the scalp, right, with ultrasound technology to see what a person's dealing with, right? And this could be whether they have a sort of, pathology or fibrosis of the hair follicle or the scalp. If I go to this section of the paper, right, this person has a sort of like a cyst, right? A cyst that's growing in their scalp. Not only that, but this other person seems to have a sort of scar tissue. Upon using ultrasound technology, we're able to see that in this dark void, right, we're able to see a sort of, displacement that's occurring that's consistent with the appearance of the cyst. Not only that, but you can see some fibrosis as well, right? If we go over here, this is AKN, acne cheilitis nuche, something like that. I forgot how to pronounce this. But AKN, this, a lot of people typically get this from dirty, razors, just a really, really bad scalp infection where you get these weird nodules and pustules. It just is awful. However, I don't think you need to use ultrasound technology to see this, right? But, this is a interesting demonstration. Using ultrasound technology in this sort of, painless kind of procedure, we're able to see, yeah, this area has a lot of excess tissue, right? This area has a lot of excess tissue, and you can possibly tell if there's fibrosis going on, right? So this is some pretty interesting stuff. If we go over here again, right? Look at this. This is fibrosis, right? We're able to see some sort of fibrosis over here. Consistent with the area of hair loss. You have a lot of inflammation here. And the ultrasound image is also sort of displaying that as well, right? Again, look at this. This is folliculitis decalvans. Folliculitis decalvans is a pretty tough cicatricial or scarring alopecia. And in folliculitis decalvans, it's typically due to some sort of microbe or, whatever it is. It could be a bacteria or fungus that causes an inflammation in the hair follicle, right? Notice the ending, itis, inflammation, right? Folliculitis, that is. But still, you can see that over here, again, this sort of black void, right? It's indicative of excess scar tissue, right? So, and you also have enlarged hair follicles as well, which is another sign of folliculitis. And then over here, other sort of issues, right? Over, you can see that this ultrasound image is able to see this sort of, I guess, abscess or lesion or swelling of some kind, right? And what is interesting here as well is that you can potentially see tumors, right? You can see areas that have increased blood flow by using colored Doppler ultrasound technology, right? So all of this has some pretty interesting utility. So when people are confused, okay, when am I going to shed, right? This sort of technology, sonography, ultrasound technology, and being able to view the scalp and see which hair follicles are in anagen, which hair follicles are in telogen, catagen, right? This can tell you when you're likely going to shed. It can give you a rough idea, right, by looking at the anagen to telogen ratio. But also it can help elucidate, you know, if you're going to have some sort of shedding cycle, right? Because you can predict, okay, if you're noticing after a huge shed that now a lot of those hair follicles are growing at the same time, right? That let's say 95% of them are now growing at the same time and they're all in anagen. You can more or less, when right around the catagen time, you can more or less predict how many, or I guess how severe your shed is going to be and how many of those hair follicles are going to kind of fall out, right? And then that can kind of give you a sort of time frame on your recovery period. So this would be really phenomenal if this could be implemented in some sort of way in a mass scale, maybe with some sort of consumer device. Not only that, though, right? I will also say that if there was some sort of methodology, and there is a methodology in doing so, where you can extract lipids or sebum from the scalp, and then, doing that before finasteride or dutasteride treatment, and then months later doing it again, you can possibly see the decline in DHT within the sebum, because 5-alpha reductase activity stimulates the sebaceous glands. So the conversion of testosterone to DHT in the sebaceous glands helps stimulate sebum output, because DHT goes into the sebaceous glands, it binds to sebocyte androgen receptors, and then it goes into those receptors and it increases again, sebum output, and that sebum is going to ultimately have, 5-alpha reductase type 1 along with DHT inside of it. So you can make an assessment if you're noticing less of those markers after, maybe by using some sort of, spectrometry technique, LCMS, liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. You can possibly sequence that sebum out and you can see its consistency, right? So hopefully my rambling makes some sense, and hopefully, this article is of your interest to you guys in the audience. And yeah, I mean, just look at this, right? Pretty cool. You can see areas of increased blood flow and decreased blood flow and normal blood flow. Also, hair follicle density, right? So let me read this paragraph real quick. It says, quote, ultrasound not only detects abnormalities in the morphology of hair follicles, but also provides qualitative estimation of follicular population from its total absence, alopecia, to reductions in follicle number. Since sonography can also detect hair cycle phase, it could have potential application in monitoring of treatments against baldness. Okay, so let's read this section over here, titled, quote, active inflammation is suggested by hair follicle alterations in diameter and or echogenicity, appearing swollen and markedly hypoechoic. Color Doppler ultrasound may add pathognomonic increase in blood flow, unquote. So hypoechoic, essentially it means you can tell if an area is swollen or inflamed in an ultrasound by it being excessively darker. And the reason why it might be darker could be due to its structural properties. So it could be made out of less dense tissue or just have different acoustic properties than the surrounding tissue. So an example, right, would be if you have this inflamed mass that's full of just fluids, right? Let's just say like interstitial fluids. that could make that tissue hypoechoic because the acoustics of that, it won't allow the sound waves to properly bounce off and create that sort of image, the white image that you're getting where you can get all these little etches and, structural views of that particular part of the tissue. And to make my point, I'm going to lead you to another study titled, quote, Ultrasound Features and Differential Diagnosis for Superficial Nodule Fasciitis, unquote. And this is by Zhuang et al., published in 2023 in the Journal of Clinical Ultrasound and Sonography and Other Imaging Techniques. That's a journal name. So if I scroll all the way down here and click this image, you can see the type of descriptions that I was talking about, right? So hypoechoic, you can see that in the darker area, that means what's going on, right? There is some sort of growth, some sort of mass, inflammatory mass that's occurring. And in the type 2 hypoechoic mass, you can see that, okay, it's bigger and there's less sort of like structural integrities, or there's less sort of mass that's reflecting, right? That's reflecting the sound waves back to the machine in order to make that sort of image, right? And over here in the type 3 hypoechoicity, if that makes any sense, the state of being hypoechoic, right? This is probably the most hypoechoic image you can get because it's such a large mass that it's occupying, a lot of space, but there's less sort of structures that are being shown here that can kind of reflect the sound wave back to the machine in order to make the image, the sonography image. So these are the stages of hypoechoicity. And I think that's pretty, apropos to what we're talking about here in this particular study that concerns sonography of pathologies in the scalp, right? Two different conditions, fasciitis involving the foot, right? And, pathologies of the scalp, involving the scalp and the hair. But it's still, nevertheless, I think interesting to kind of, make that learning connection here where all we're trying to focus at this point in time is learning what hypoechoicity is. And this is hypoechoic. As you can see over here, like which structure is more hypoechoic than the other one, right? If we look at A, B, C, D, E, and F, I can possibly say that E is the least hypoechoic, right? But I can possibly say the most hypoechoic picture that I can see here is probably B. Why would I say B? Well, because I don't see, at least in the hypoechoic region, right? I don't see that many white or tissue structures, right? I don't see any structure that's reflecting the sound waves back because it's very dark. Okay, so I don't see any white in it. And if I look at, over here in D, D is hypoechoic in some areas, but not everywhere. But that can be indicative of maybe there's some sort of, structural change to that tissue. Maybe this could be a sort of scarring, right? Maybe it has a consistency of a sort of fibrosis, right? Rather than a sort of mass that's growing. So the hypoechoic nature of a particular image can kind of tell you what you're dealing with and present a story, right? So in my opinion, I think you have to first take into account the nature of the body part or organ or tissue, rather, that you're looking at. And then you have to take into account the hypoechoicity pattern that's kind of being shown in the images. So that's pretty important. And by combining color Doppler ultrasound, it can show some sort of pattern to that sort of inflamed area, right? So it can suggest that if that area is very inflamed, you can possibly see with color Doppler technology if there's blood going to that area, if there's an excess amount of blood flow or maybe a decreased amount of blood flow. Or you can see an excess amount of, fluid like I mentioned earlier. However, this video is going on way too long for its worth. And again, I just wanted to share this, right? And there's some other cool things in this paper as well. I think they had like eyelids and eyelashes. So over here, right, you can see this is an eyelash, right? And this is the ocular globes of someone's eye. But you can see, the hair follicles of eyelashes. And I think another cool sort of prospect with this kind of technology is that if you're doing let's say, a hair transplant, you can see the areas of the scalp where you likely, let's say in the case of a diffuse alopecia, you can see the areas of the scalp where you probably don't want to transplant in, where you want to be a bit more careful in transplanting in. Or maybe you can see areas of the scalp that possibly with longer term treatment, right, you may be able to get a sort of increase in hair. That's possible. And maybe you can possibly see areas of the scalp that are, it might look like androgenetic alopecia at first sight, but it could be alopecia areata, right? Where you might notice that there's still some metabolically active hair follicles, but they're not necessarily proliferating to any significant extent to make it outside of outside of the skin. So that's something to consider. But again, all in all, this technology is very interesting and it's old technology. It just needs a new application. So thanks for watching this video, guys, and I hope to see you on the next one. And thanks for supporting the channel. This video will be going out to the members first. So yeah, see you on the next one. Bye, guys.